Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste. Today we move forward with our discussion on ecological energetics and look at some nutrient cycles. So, as always we begin with the definition. What is a nutrient? A substance used by an organism to survive, grow and reproduce. So, essentially when any organism is having food, it is getting a number of nutrients. Those nutrients, in our parlance we say that we are getting proteins, carbohydrates, fats, minerals and so on. But then if we look at these minerals more fundamentally, so we are getting some elements out of these nutrients. So, when we are talking about say carbohydrates or fats, we are getting carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. When we are talking about proteins, we are getting nitrogen. When we are talking about other mineral salts, we are getting say iron, or we are getting copper, or we are getting selenium, and all of these are different minerals or all of these are different nutrients when we talk about in the parlance of ecology as well. So, when we talk about say plant nutrition, a plant is not getting carbohydrates or fats or proteins from somewhere else, because a plant is a producer, it is producing its own food. But even when it is producing its own food, it will require some nutrients. Those nutrients will be say carbon dioxide or water or some mineral salts that it will use to make all of these different food items. So, all of those substances will be called as nutrients. So, a nutrient is a substance that is used by an organism to survive, grow and reproduce, that is to carry on its life functions, survival, growth and reproduction. Now, if we talk about nutrients, there are certain nutrients that an organism requires in larger concentrations or larger amounts, and there are some nutrients that are required by the organisms in smaller amounts. So, for instance, if we talk about ourselves, we require much more amount of carbohydrates and proteins and fats than say we have a requirement of say sodium in the form of sodium chloride, which is our common salt. So, for us we will say that carbohydrates, proteins and fats are the nutrients that we require in larger quantities, and substances such as sodium chloride or maybe some amount of selenium or some amount of say magnesium is something that will require in very smaller quantities. Now, similarly, when we talk about the nutrition of plants, and in this particular lecture we will be mostly concentrating ourselves with the nutrition of plants, because once the plants have made their food products, then those products get moved on with the different food chains and food webs. So, in the case of plants, when we talk about macronutrients or nutrients that are required in larger amounts, we can talk about primary nutrients, that is nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, NPK. So, for instance, whenever we are talking about fertilizers, we always talk about the NPK fertilizers, the fertilizers that provide you nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. So, these are the primary nutrients, or they can include the secondary nutrients such as calcium, magnesium or sulfur. So, these are the nutrients that the plants require in larger amounts. Now, micronutrients or trace elements are the nutrients that are needed in small or trace amounts, and in the case of plants, it could include things like boron, copper, iron, chlorine, manganese, zinc, molybdenum and so on. And when we are talking about nutrients, one definition is about macro and micronutrients, the second one is about essential and non-essential nutrients. Now, essential nutrients are those nutrients that are required by the plant and that cannot be substituted by anything else. So, there are three criteria for determining whether an element is essential or not. The first one is that in the absence of the element, the plant should be unable to complete their life cycle. So, if we say that suppose carbon is an essential element, so in the absence of carbon, the plant will be unable to complete its life cycle because all of its parts are made of carbon. The second criteria is that the deficiency of an essential element cannot be met by supplying some other element. So, suppose in place of providing a plant with carbon dioxide, you try to provide it with say sulfur dioxide, or maybe you try to provide it with say ammonia. So, anything that does not have carbon. Now, if you provide a plant with anything that does not have carbon, the deficiency of carbon cannot be met by supplying some other element. So, it is a sine qua non for the growth of plants. It is an extremely essential thing and the plant cannot live without it. And the third one is that the element must be directly involved in the metabolism of the plant. So, these are the three criteria to determine whether an element is an essential element or not. Now, let us look at some essential elements and their roles. Let us begin with nitrogen. Now, nitrogen is an essential element because if you do not give nitrogen to a plant, it will not be able to complete its life cycle. Nitrogen cannot be replaced by any other element, and nitrogen is essential for the metabolism of the plant. Now, why? Because nitrogen is a constituent of proteins. So, different amino acids. So, when we say amino, the amine group is the nitrogen group. So, it is a constituent of different proteins. It is there in the nucleic acids. So, when we talk about DNA or RNA, that also contains nitrogen. It is a constituent of several vitamins and hormones in the case of plants and also in the case of animals as well. So, nitrogen is an essential element because it is a constituent of proteins, nucleic acids, vitamins, hormones and so on. Another essential element is phosphorus. Now, phosphorus is a constituent of nucleic acid. Again, in the case of DNA or RNA, we have phosphorus. It is a constituent of ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency in a cell. So, when a cell needs to move energy from one place to another, or when a cell needs to use energy for some particular purpose, it will be using the energy that is stored in the ATP molecules. So, the ATP will get converted to ADP and it will release out energy for some chemical reaction, and phosphorus is an essential part of ATP. Phosphorus is also a constituent of the cell membrane of a cell. So, cell membrane is the outer layer that contains all the constituents of the cell inside the cell. So, it separates what is inside the cell and what is outside the cell, and phosphorus is a constituent of the cell membrane, and it is also a constituent of certain proteins. Now, here again phosphorus is an essential element because the plant cannot live without it. You cannot replace it or substitute it with anything else, and it is involved in the metabolism in the plants because of its role in nucleic acids, ATP, cell membrane, proteins and so on. Another essential nutrient is potassium. So, when we talk about NPK, this is N, this is P, this is K. Now, potassium is called kalium when we look at its Greek roots, and kalium is represented by K. Now, potassium is a part of the cation anion balance that is needed for maintaining cell turgidity, opening and closing of stomata, activation of certain enzymes and so on. Now, when we say turgidity, it is an expression of the pressure that is being contained inside a cell. So, for instance, if you have a cell and you take out the water that is inside, so the cell will become flaccid. So, it will look like a balloon that is now not inflated. So, and turgidity is when you take a balloon and you inflate it, then we say that this balloon is turgid. In the case of plants, in the case of a number of cells, this turgidity is not governed by the movement of air, but by the movement of water. And for that case, the amount of osmolarity in the cell is essential. So, if you have more amount of salt in inside a cell, so the salt will attract more amount of water from outside and will result in the increase of turgidity of the cell, and potassium plays a key role there because it is involved in the cation anion balance, and this cell turgidity in turn regulates the opening and closing of stomata, and stomata are the pores in the leaves through which the gaseous exchange occurs in the case of plants, and potassium is also involved in the activation of certain enzymes. Another essential nutrient is calcium, and calcium is used in the formation of calcium pectate in the cell wall, and calcium pectate especially plays a role in the cell division. So, when you have a plant cell that is dividing into two cells, so calcium pectate will form a layer that will separate the two cells or the two daughter cells. So, it is a part of the calcium pectate in the cell wall. It is also involved in the activation of certain enzymes, and it also plays a role in the calcium channels in the cell membranes. Next we have magnesium. Magnesium is a constituent of chlorophyll. So, just like our hemoglobin contains iron inside it, similarly chlorophyll contains a magnesium ion inside it. So, magnesium is important because it is involved in the formation of chlorophyll. It is a constituent of chlorophyll, plus it is required in the activation of certain respiration enzymes. So, if you remove magnesium from the cell, you will not have any chlorophyll, and the plant will and the cell will not be able to respire. Next is sulfur. Sulfur is the constituent of amino acids cysteine and methionine, and it is also a constituent of several vitamins and coenzymes. So, here are some of the essential elements that the plant requires, and this is not an exhaustive list. There are also a number of other essential elements that are required by the plant. So, we looked at essential and non-essential elements. We looked at macronutrients and micronutrients. Macronutrient is something that you require in large amounts, micronutrients is something that you require in smaller amounts. So, let us now have a look at what all things does a plant need. So, we will divide this list into two parts. One is the macronutrients and the second one is the micronutrients. In the case of macronutrients, we can divide it into again three subcategories. The first is the macronutrients that are derived from air and water, and this includes carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. Now, carbon is derived from the air in the form of carbon dioxide. So, here you have carbon and you have oxygen, and hydrogen is derived from water H2O. So, here you have hydrogen and oxygen. So, essentially the requirements of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, these are the three macronutrients that the plant needs in very large amounts, and these are met from the air and water. The second is primary macronutrients, and primary macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, NPK. So, we can very easily remember it by NPK, and these NPK they come from the soil. So, they come from the mineral salts that are there in the soil or are added to the soil in the form of fertilizers, and the plant takes these macronutrients along with the water that gets absorbed by the roots. So, these are the primary macronutrients. Then we have secondary and tertiary macronutrients, which includes sulfur, calcium and magnesium. Now, here again sulfur, calcium and magnesium are required in large quantities, but not as large as NPK or as large as CHO. So, these are the macronutrients that a plant needs. Next we have a list of the micronutrients. Now, remember again micronutrients are required in smaller quantities. So, in the case of plants it includes iron, molybdenum, boron, copper, manganese, sodium, zinc, nickel, chlorine, cobalt, aluminium, silicon, vanadium, selenium. Now, all of these micronutrients they play an important role in the activation of certain enzymes, in the functioning of certain proteins as coenzymes in certain cases, or in the case of things like sodium and chlorine, this also plays an important role in the water balance inside the cell. So, in the case of water balance we are talking about the turgidity. So, if you have more amount of sodium chloride or say potassium chloride inside a cell, so it will absorb more amount of water, and so it will become more and more turgid. But then you have the situation that all the plants require all of these nutrients, but then these nutrients are not present in an infinite quantity on earth. So, there is a certain repository of these nutrients, but then the plants have been growing for ages. So, in that case how do they get these nutrients? If you have a certain stock, it is through the biogeochemical cycles. So, what we are saying here is that if you have a plant and this plant is growing in the soil and the soil has certain amount of nutrients, and then these plants get eaten up by animals, they get eaten up by other carnivorous animals and so on. So, ultimately these nutrients that are taken up by the roots of the plant, they should ultimately come back to the earth, so that if there is another plant that is growing, then it should have access to these nutrients. So, the movement of the nutrients will occur in a cyclical manner. So, it moves from the soil through the plants into the animals, and then through the animals and the decomposers it will move back to the soil. So, this forms a cycle, and we call these cycles as biogeochemical cycles. So, because these involve biological processes, these involve geological processes, and these also involve chemical processes. So, these are biogeochemical cycles. They can be defined as a pathway by which a chemical substance moves through biotic and abiotic compartments of the earth. So, it is a pathway, it is a route through which chemical substances are moving through biosphere and abiotic components, that is lithosphere, which is the rocky portion of the earth, atmosphere, that is the airy portion of the earth, and hydrosphere, which is the watery portion of the earth, compartments of the earth. So, this is essentially a biogeochemical cycle, and in general we can represent a biogeochemical cycle like this. So, you have a nutrient pool. When we say a nutrient pool, it is a repository of the nutrients. You can have this repository either in the soil or maybe in the water or maybe in the air. So, for instance, if you are talking about carbon, so the pool of carbon is there in the air in the form of carbon dioxide, and then this pool is then utilized by the producers or the plants, which also gain energy from the sun to use these nutrients from the nutrient pool, and then they make food or they make certain biological molecules. Now, from these plants it goes to the herbivores and then it goes to the carnivores, and from all three of these it moves through the decomposers back into the nutrient cycle. So, for instance, if you have a dead leaf, so this dead leaf will be eaten up by say earthworms, and after the earthworms have eaten it and they have increased the surface area, so a number of bacteria and fungi will act on it, and ultimately they will all convert it back into carbon dioxide. Now, whether it is a dead leaf or maybe a dung of an animal or maybe the carcass of an animal, so all of these will be decomposed back into carbon dioxide. Or if we are talking about a pool that is present in the soil, let us talk about say calcium that has been derived from the soil. So, this calcium is taken up by the plants through their roots, then it gets into some biological molecules, from there it moves to the herbivores, to the carnivores, and then when the decomposers are decomposing the dead and decaying parts of these animals or the dungs and excreta of these animals, so after that all that calcium will be then released back into the nutrient pool, which in this case will be the soil. Now, in this lecture we will have a look at certain biogeochemical cycles in more detail. Let us begin with the nitrogen cycle. Now, in the case of nitrogen cycle, we do not have one pool, but we have two pools. The first pool is the atmospheric nitrogen. So, more than 70% of our of the air that is surrounding us, that is nitrogen, and the second pool is that of the soil nitrates which are present in the soil. Now, a plant is unable to use the atmospheric nitrogen directly, so it has to take up the nitrogen in the form of nitrates which should come into the soil. So, how does this atmospheric nitrogen reach the soils? It is through say biological fixation. So, we had talked about mutualistic relationships between these bacteria by the name of rhizobium, which live in the root nodules of certain leguminous plants. So, these bacteria are able to fix this atmospheric nitrogen. So, they convert the atmospheric nitrogen into a form that the plants are able to use. So, biological fixation is one way in which nitrogen moves from the atmospheric pool to the soil pool. The second one is lightning. So, when you have lightning, there is an intense amount of heat and electrical discharge, and in that case nitrogen and oxygen, both the gases that are present in the atmosphere, they can react together and they can form nitrates and nitrates, which then come down to the soil through rain. So, that is the second way. And the third process is industrial fixation. So, these days, because we want to put more amount of nitrates into the soil, so that the plants can use them, especially for agricultural production. So, we are artificially converting the nitrogen that is there in the air into the nitrates. So, that is the other way in which the atmospheric nitrogen can get converted into the soil nitrates. So, here we are saying that this pool is the nitrogen from this pool is moving into this pool. But then again, because we are talking about cycles, so if nitrogen can move from the first pool to the second pool, it should also be able to move from the second pool to the first pool. So, if you have soil nitrates, so there can be denitrification and volcanic activities that can convert the nitrates that are there in the soil or that are there in the rocks back into nitrogen, and through both of these processes, denitrification and volcanic activity, nitrogen can move from this pool of the soil into the atmospheric pool. Now, that is the movement of nitrogen between both of these pools, but then how does it move through the biological system? So, these soil nitrates can be taken up by the plants, and then these nitrates can be used to form different components such as the proteins. Now, when the plant has formed certain proteins, the plant gets eaten up by the animals, and then plants and animals, when they are dead and decaying, they are decomposed further by the decomposers, and then so the nitrogen has moved from the soil nitrates to the plants, plants to animals, and plants and animals to the decomposers. Now, these decomposers can further break down these proteins and convert them either into ammonia or they can convert it into nitrates, and in this process, which is known as ammonification or nitrification, it can then come back to the soil nitrates pool. So, here we are talking about two things. One is the pools. So, these are the two pools that we have, and the second one is the fluxes. The flux is the rate at which the nutrient is moving from one pool to another or from one pool into some other organic substance. So, if we talk about the rate at which soil nitrates are taken up by all the plants on the earth, then we are talking about the flux of nitrogen that is moving from the soil pool into the plants. So, that is the generalized nitrogen cycle, and we will look at the sub processes in more detail now. So, when we talk about nitrogen fixation, it is the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, and this occurs through biological fixation or lightning or industrial fixation. So, it can be converted into either ammonia or it can be converted into nitrates and nitrates, but mostly we say that the first stage is the conversion into ammonia. So, this is the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, which occurs through these three processes. Now, the first one is called as biological nitrogen fixation. Now, biological nitrogen fixation is the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, and it occurs in the biological organisms. So, in this case you have this nitrogen which is acted upon in the presence of this enzyme called nitrogenase, and it converts it into ammonia, and it is done by rhizobium. So, rhizobium is a bacterium that lives in the root nodules of leguminous plants, or it can be done by certain free living bacteria such as azotobacter, or it can be done using some cyanobacteria. So, cyanobacteria is, cyano refers to blue. So, these include things like nostoc and anabina. So, these can also perform biological nitrogen fixation. We can also get ammonia by the decomposition of organic nitrogen in the dead plants and animals through the process of ammonification. Now, in the process of ammonification, you have the organic molecules that are rich in nitrogen, and they are in this process of ammonification they are converted into ammonia. Now, ammonification generally happens because of the action of decomposers. So, if you have say a piece of egg that is lying around, you will have some bacterial growth, and then it will convert the proteins, especially the albumin that is there in the egg, and it will convert it into ammonia and it will release it back. So, this is the process of ammonification. Next, we have the process of nitrification. Now, in the process of nitrification, the ammonia that has been produced. Now, ammonia is typically a toxic substance for most of the organisms. So, it needs to be converted to something else so that it is gotten rid of. So, nitrification is the process in which there is a biological oxidation of ammonia into nitrites and nitrates. So, in this case you have ammonia that is reacting with oxygen, and it can be done through organisms like Nitrosomonas and Nitrococcus, and they will convert this ammonia into nitrites, and then these nitrites can be further oxidized using nitrobacters and converted into nitrates. Oh, this should be 3 NO3 minus. So, you have nitrates that are converted into nitrates, and these nitrifying bacteria, those that are converting ammonia into nitrates and nitrates, they are chemoautotrophs. So, they are autotrophs, they are making their own food using chemical reaction. So, they are chemoautotrophs. Now, in the industrial process, we have the Haber process. In the Haber process, we have nitrogen and hydrogen that are reacted together. So, these two gases are reacted at high temperature and pressure in the presence of catalyst to form ammonia, and once you have this ammonia, you can then further convert it into the nitrates using the Ostwald process. Now, in the case of Ostwald process, you have ammonia that reacts with oxygen in the presence of catalyst to form NO, then NO is further oxidized in the presence of catalyst to form NO2, and then NO2 is then further oxidized in the presence of catalyst to form NO3, and it is also reacted with water. So, it gives you HNO3. So, that is the nitric acid. Once you have the nitric acid, you can combine it with any base to get a nitrate salt. So, if you add HNO3 with NaOH, you get NaNO3, which is sodium nitrate. So, that is all about the nitrogen cycle. Let us have a look at the carbon cycle. Now, in the case of carbon cycle, the main pool is the carbon in the atmosphere, but then carbon is also stored in other pools, especially like pools like oceans, or pools like soil carbon, or pools like the biological carbon in the form of forest. But in this case, when we are talking about the carbon cycle, we will mostly focus on the atmospheric pool because that is the largest pool. Now, here you have carbon in the atmosphere, and then this carbon can be utilized in the process of weathering, and it can form carbon in the rocks. Now, what we are saying here is that if you say have a rock that has calcium hydroxide, it can react with carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide plus water, because carbon dioxide normally comes down with rain in the form of H2CO3, and in this case it will form CaCO3 plus 2H2O. Now, in this process what is happening is that the calcium hydroxide that is present in the rocks, it is being acted upon by carbon dioxide and water to form calcium carbonate, and with the release of water. So, this thing was coming from H2O plus CO2. So, here you have CO2 in the atmosphere that is being converted into CO2 in the rocks, and in this process, which is known as weathering. So, in the process of weathering, when this reaction is happening, this rock will also break down. Once it breaks down, then further internal minerals will be more and more available for weathering. So, in the process of weathering, you can have carbon in the atmosphere that becomes locked into carbon in the rocks in the form of calcium carbonate. And then in a number of tectonic processes, which is the process in which the plates of the earth collide against each other, move past each other, move into the mantle, or maybe give rise to volcanic activities, you can have the release of these carbons. So, if you say have the CaCO3 and then it is heated up, so it will form calcium oxide plus CO2. So, this CO2 gets released into the atmosphere, and this calcium oxide in the presence of water, it can act with water and then it can form CaOH twice once again. So, what we are saying here is that carbon can very easily move from this one pool, which is carbon in the atmosphere, to carbon in the lithosphere. So, that is the second pool. Another pool is carbon that is present in the ocean water. Now, in this case, you have that carbon in the atmosphere can get dissolved in the water to form carbon in the ocean water. So, what we are saying here is that you have CO2 that is reacting with H2O to form H2CO3. So, in this case, this carbon that was there in the atmosphere has now reached into the oceans. So, this is the process in which through dissolution the carbon can reach into the third pool of carbon, which is the ocean water, and then from this ocean water it can come back to the carbon pool through the release of carbon. So, in this process it is nothing but you have the reverse process. So, you have H2CO3 that can give rise to CO2 and H2O. Now, once you have carbon in this pool, carbon in the atmosphere, it can be taken up by the producers through the process of photosynthesis and converted into biomass. Now, once you have this carbon in the form of biomass, in the form of say cellulose or different carbohydrates or say protein molecules or fat molecules, once you have it in the biomass, so this biomass can get consumed by the other organisms, the herbivores, and then from herbivores into the carnivores, apex predators and so on. And so, this biomass is converted into different kinds of organic matter like food webs, or it can reach into the soil, and in all of these processes this biomass can also be used by the plants themselves. During respiration it can be released back into the atmosphere, or once it has reached into the animals, from there it moves into the decomposers, which can then again release it back into the atmosphere, or when the animals are respiring, so there also they are releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So, this is the process in which the carbon will move through the through different food chains and food webs. But then we can also convert this organic matter, or rather we can also see the conversion of this organic matter into one other pool, which is the fossil fuels. And in this case this process is known as lithification, in which you have these plants and animals that get buried inside the earth, and then slowly and steadily they get converted into things like petroleum or coal. So, this is the process in which carbon will reach this pool, which is the pool of the fossil fuels, and then these fossil fuels, when they are burnt, they will release carbon back into the atmosphere. So, this arrowhead should not be here, it should be on this side. So, in that case this fossil fuel will release carbon back into the atmosphere through the process of combustion. So, that is the carbon cycle. Another cycle is the water cycle, because water is also an essential nutrient that is providing two essential elements, hydrogen and oxygen. Now, water cycle is something that we all know. There is water in different water bodies, it gets evaporated and forms water vapor because of the heat that is given out by the sun, and when this water vapor condenses it forms clouds. When these clouds are then further cooled down, so all this water forms droplets, it falls down in the form of rain, which we call as precipitation. Now, this rain can fall either into these big water bodies, or it can fall into the land. Now, on the land this water will be absorbed into the soil, it will percolate down, or it will move through runoff. In the process of runoff it is getting into the streams and rivers, and then ultimately reaching into the big water bodies like oceans and seas. So, that is runoff, or it can get accumulated in some terrestrial water bodies such as ponds or lakes. And here again you can have the process of evaporation that is happening, or you can have these plants that are absorbing the groundwater, and then in the process of transpiration they are releasing it back into the atmosphere. Or you can have the situation in which this percolated water, it moves below the ground and then it also reaches into the oceans. So, here again we see a cyclical process. The water is, you can start from any point and then it will move a complete cycle. So, this is the water cycle. Another cycle is the phosphorus cycle. Now, in the case of the phosphorus cycle, the main pool is the rock phosphates. Now, the rock phosphates, that is the phosphorus that is present in the rocks. Now, when these rocks undergo some amount of weathering, so this these phosphates will be converted into the soil phosphates. So, these are more or less soluble forms of phosphates that are there in the soil, and this is a two-way process. So, the rock phosphate can convert into the soil phosphates, and these soil phosphates can precipitate down and then they can become incorporated into the rock phosphates. Now, once the phosphorus has reached into the soil, it can be taken up by the plants. From the plants it moves to animals, and from plants and animals it moves to the decomposers, and from there it comes back into the soil. So, this is a small cycle that is happening here. Now, the other cycle that is happening is that when you have these soil phosphates and there is rainfall, so some amount of phosphate can get dissolved in the water, move along with the streams and rivers, move in a runoff, and with this runoff it can go into the oceans, and in the oceans it might start precipitating out. When it starts precipitating out, it gets to the bottom of the oceans, and then through tectonic forces or tectonic processes it might again get converted into some rocks, so that it forms a rock phosphate again, and this rock phosphate later on becomes exposed again through the tectonic processes like earthquakes. So, in these processes these rocks are exposed into the air, and in that case they will again start weathering and the process will continue. So, that is the phosphorus cycle. Another cycle is the sulfur cycle. Now, in the case of the sulfur cycle, you have a number of sulfur compounds that are there in the air, and then when there is rainfall, so these sulfates can get these SO2, SO3 molecules, they can react with water and then they will come down into the earth. Once they have come down into the earth in the form of sulfates, they can be taken up by the plants, from plants to animals, from plants and animals into the decomposers, from there back into the soil. Plus there can be processes like release of H2S or release of SO2 that is happening below the in the oceans, or maybe through the action of decomposers. And also these days a very important portion is the release of sulfur through the fossil fuel combustion. So, in this case we have these industries that are spewing out sulfur, and if the sulfur is very high, if these sulfur dioxides are very high in concentration, so nearby you can have acid rain which will then further come down into the soil, and in this process increase the acidity of the soil, maybe lead to the deaths of a number of plants and so on. Plus sulfur is also released in huge amounts through the volcanoes. So, the large releases are the industrial release and the volcanic release. Then when sulfur is there in the air, so it might react with oxygen, become converted into sulfur dioxide or sulfur trioxide, then it will come down with water again in the form of acid rain. From there it will get absorbed by the plants, it will move through the biosphere and then again come back to the soil and then get released back into the atmosphere. So, that is the sulfur cycle. So, once we have looked at all of these different cycles, the next question is, so what? If all these cycles just work as they should, so in that case there would be hardly any need to understand these cycles. But then these days we are also seeing a number of impacts of human interventions on all of these different cycles. Now, what kinds of impacts are we seeing? Say in the case of the carbon cycle, we are spewing out a huge quantity of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere by the burning of the fossil fuels. So, because of that, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been rising. Now, if that happens, it might lead to global warming, or it is already leading to climate change and things like that. That is one aspect. The second aspect is that in the case of sulfur cycle, we are seeing a huge amount of release of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere because of different industries that are again using up the fossil fuels, or that are involved in the processing of different metals. So, in the processing of or conversion of ores into metals, quite a huge amount of sulfur dioxide is also released if the ore is a sulfur rich compound. Or in the case of nitrogen cycle, we are seeing a huge change because of the industrial nitrogen fixation. Now, when we are using the Haber process, when we are using the Ostwald process, we are making these fertilizers, but then in the same process we are tinkering with the flux rates that should be there in the environment, or that should be a part of the ecology. So, suppose in the normal biological cycles you have X amount of nitrogen that is present in the form of nitrates in the soil, because you are adding more nitrates in the form of industrial nitrogen fixation, it converts from X to say X plus Y. So, what we are saying is that earlier we had this X amount of nitrogen that was there in the soil, and from there we have converted it into X plus Y. Now, this extra portion of Y might lead to n number of consequences in the whole of the ecosystem. So, it will increase the growth of plants, it will increase the number of say planktons or algae that are there in the water bodies, but then it can also lead to situations such as eutrophication. Now, similarly, when you have this nitrogen in the soil, so with water it also gets into the water bodies. Now, the water bodies are not only home to the plants, but then these water bodies also provide source of water to different animals. Now, if there is an animal that is getting a huge amount of nitrates from its water, it might also lead to severe health consequences such as methemoglobinemia. Now, when we are looking at these aspects, any change that is brought about by the human beings can lead to a plethora of changes in the ecosystems. So, now let us look at some impacts of human interventions, and let us begin with the water cycle. Now, if you have a rainfall in the forest, what happens to this rain? So, some of this rain, it directly gets to the soil, and from there it might either get into a runoff, or it might infiltrate into the soil and become a part of the groundwater or start a subsurface flow. So, that is one portion. The second portion is that it gets intercepted by the trees, and from these trees it will start dripping off in the form of the crown dip or in the form of stem flow, and again come back, and in this direct through fall it was coming at a very high speed. In this case it is coming down at more of a trickle speed because it has been intercepted here. And then you also have quite a lot of litter, quite a number of small plants that are there, and so the water also gets percolated and it also gets absorbed by these litter. Now, that is about the water that is coming down. What about the water that can go up? Now, when you have these plants that are intercepting the rainwater, so there can be some amount of evaporation because of this interception. There can be some amount of transpiration in which the plants are taking water from the soil and then releasing it back into the atmosphere, or you can have some amount of evaporation that is directly coming because of the litter or because of the soil. So, this is basically what happens when it rains in a forest. Now, what happens when you cut a forest? Now, the changes in the stream flows are given by the Coxera curve. Now, in the case of the Coxera curve, there are some forests in Australia that got burnt, and once you have a forest that does not have any more trees, what are the impacts into the stream flows that you will observe? So, the first thing is that you will see that on the y axis here you have the annual in the average annual yield in terms of millimeter in the streams, and you will find that the stream flow will reduce drastically within say 20 years. You will see a peak decline. Now, it appears a bit counterintuitive, because if you have trees in a forest, so those trees are taking out water from the soil and they are releasing it back into the atmosphere. So, that much amount of water will not be able to reach back into the streams, whereas if you remove those trees, so all the water that is falling down, it will become a part of the either the runoff, or it will get percolated into the water table. But then here we are observing that once you cut the trees, the amount of water that is available in the streams, it also reduces, and we will look at the reasons in a short while. So, in a period of like 20 years, you will see that the amount of water that is available in the streams, it moves from 1200 millimeter right up to 600 millimeter. So, it has roughly halved. So, a number of streams that were being provided water because of those forests, they would dry off. Then there would be this process of recovery that will take a very long period of time, even say around 150 years. So, in this long period, the forests are gradually growing up, and after a while you will see that the stream flow comes back to the normal value of 1200 millimeters. But then the question is, what is happening in between? Why do we see a dip in the stream flow? Now, if you have a forest that has been cleared, so in that area you have nutrients that are available in the soil, you have water that is coming in the form of precipitation. So, there will be some growth of plants. Now, let us see what happens because those plants are growing, because remember that when a plant is growing, so it is converting a lot of nutrients into its body parts. So, it is making up lots of cellulose. When it is making up those cellulose, where is it getting the hydrogen from? Because cellulose is also a carbohydrate. So, it has carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. So, where is this hydrogen coming from? And then when there is a plant that is growing up, what is the amount of water that it is going to leave out or through transpiration? So, if we look at these forests and these and the amounts of water that were being used up by different components of the ecosystem when they were studied, we see that in the case of this stand age. So, if you have a forest that has plants that are roughly 15 years of age, so in that case the overstory transpiration is very large. Now, overstory transpiration is the amount of water that is being released because of these plants. And the second portion, the runoff, is very less. Now, runoff is the amount of water that you will get into the streams. So, the runoff is less, more and more amount of water has been lost because of overstory transpiration, some amount because of understory transpiration, then there is a huge amount that gets intercepted, then there is some amount that is released because of the soil and later evaporation, and we can see that roughly the amount that is released in the soil and later evaporation, it remains same with the age of the stand. But as the forest matures, you see that the amount of overstory transpiration, it reduces significantly. So, because your plants have already grown very large, they do not have to make more amount of cellulose, they only have to make cellulose to maintain themselves. So, the amount of water that is required or the amount of water that is being lost because of transpiration, it reduces. Now, at the same time, the understory transpiration increases a bit, because now you have plants that are very tall and you have plants that are there in the bottom canopy or in the ground cover, and these plants are now using up more and more amount of water to sustain themselves. And because you have these losses that are reducing, so the amount of runoff, it increases. So, once you have a mature forest, you will have this much amount of water that is coming out into the streams. If you have another forest that is a very young forest, so you will have a very less amount of water that is coming out into the streams. Other changes that happen are things like changes in the pH because of deforestation. So, once you have a forest that is mature, and if you look at the stream water, so you have this pH value of say around 5.5 to 6. So, here we have two watersheds that have a good number of trees, and then here we have this third watershed that is down here, and this is the watershed that was deforested. So, in this case you had these hills, and in these hills there were two patches that were created. So, it is something like this, because the water that is falling here, so when it rains, so all this water gets into this particular stream. So, all this area was deforested. The area that was draining into this stream was deforested and the rest of the area was left as such. So, if you perform this deforestation in a watershed, so you are clearing off all the trees that were there in this area. Once that happens, you can observe that the pH of the water lowers, and it lowers significantly. So, when you have a pH that is close to 6, that is more or less a normal water or a neutral water. A completely neutral water will have a pH of 7, a pH 6 is slightly acidic water, but if you have a pH that is close to 4, that is highly acidic water. Now, if you have a water that is highly acidic, then probably a number of organisms will not be able to survive in it. So, deforestation not only changes the amount of water that is available in these streams, it also changes the pH of water that is coming into the streams. Now, let us look at the changes in other ionic concentrations. So, the most important is the nitrate concentration. So, if you have a forest in which you do not have in which you are not cutting out your trees, so the amount of nitrates that is available in terms of milligrams per liter is say close to around 2 milligrams per liter. Now, which is shown in this bottom curve, which is representing a watershed that was not deforested. Now, in the case of this second watershed that was deforested, you see that the nitrate concentration, so this is the point when the deforestation was complete, and in a short while it increased to as much as 60 milligrams of nitrates per liter of water. Now, if you have a water that is containing say 2 milligrams of nitrates per liter, so that is a water that is a very good water, it is a potable water, it can be had for drinking by not only the animals but also the human beings. But if you have a water that is having as high as 60 milligrams per liter of nitrates, so that is a very high concentration of nitrates. If you drink that water, you will suffer from a number of diseases such as methemoglobinemia. Not only that, if you have such huge concentration of nitrates in water, then it might also result in some amount of algal bloom. So, as we had seen in the case of the Potomac river, in which we had in one of the earlier lectures, we had seen that this whole river was covered with algae. Now, we are seeing the change in the nitrate concentration of as much as 30 times from 2 milligram to 60 milligrams. So, there is a 30-fold increase in the amount of nitrates that is now available in the water. Similarly, if you look at the amount of sulfates, the amount of sulfates it reduces drastically. So, from around 7 it becomes halved, so it becomes around 3 milligrams per liter. In the case of chloride, there is a slight increase. In the case of silicates, there is a slight increase, but then what we are seeing here is that once you are cutting off your trees, once you are deforesting an area, so that is changing not only the plants that are there in that particular area, but then because it is changing the concentration of different nutrients that are there in the water, so that will have an impact throughout the ecosystem, because even the areas which are very downstream, but because they are getting water from this area, so they will also start suffering some impacts. Now, other impacts are these. So, here we are looking at the concentration of calcium in the water. So, in the normal conditions you have a calcium concentration of around 10 milligrams per liter. Once you have cut your forest, it increases from 10 milligrams per liter to as high as 110 milligrams per liter. Now, all of this water is not coming from all of this calcium is not coming from the biological entities, but what is happening here is that the plants were able to hold to the soil, and the soil also has a huge amount of calcium inside. So, because the plant roots were able to hold to the soil, so this calcium just remained there in the system. But once you have cut these plants, so once these once the soil is now getting exposed, it is now getting converted into an unbound form. So, all of this calcium has now started to leach into the water streams, and all of this calcium then will start flowing downstream. If we look at the magnesium concentration also increases, it more than doubles. In the case of potassium concentration, the potassium concentration becomes as much as 4 times. The sodium concentration, it nearly doubles. The aluminum concentration, it also increases up to around say 3 times. So, if you look at just one process, that is deforestation, that is being done by the human beings, it is leading to so many changes in the water quality, in the amount of nutrients that is available in the water. Now, that changes not only the water quality for drinking by the animals, but that also changes the rate of growth of plants downstream, which because those plants are getting their nutrients from this water source as well. Now, this is just one process. Now, let us consider another process, the incorporation of nitrates in the form of fertilizers, or the use of fertilizers that have all these N, P and K into the farmlands. Now, when that water gets leached out, when along with the runoff, when all those nutrients are able to reach into the streams and into the water bodies, that will lead to an immense amount of algal bloom. And because of that immense amount of algal bloom, in a very short period of time, the water quality will deteriorate so much that you will have very less amount of oxygen, and your water body will not be able to support any further life form. So, just because the activities of human beings are changing these nutrient cycles, so it becomes very important these days to understand what are the impacts of our activities into different nutrient cycles, so that we are able to reduce our impact on the ecosystem, especially the negative impacts. So, in this lecture we started by looking at what are nutrients, then we classified the nutrients into macronutrients and micronutrients. We looked at different nutrients, what are their roles. We looked at the essential elements, the conditions or the criteria for essentiality. Then we looked at a generalized nutrient cycle, how nutrients move from one pool to another pool, or from one pool into the biosphere and then back again. And then we looked at different nutrient cycles in more detail. And finally, we looked at the consequences of some human activities such as deforestation, and these activities can have a large impact on a number of nutrient cycles, because the amount of nutrients that are present in different pools, it changes a lot. And similar is the impact when we are using industrial nitrogen fixation, or when we are using fertilizers, or when we are spewing out sulfur dioxide because of our activities in the mining sector or in the ore sector, or maybe because or maybe when we are releasing out carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide when we are burning up the fossil fuels. So, that is all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.